Matthew 17, 1-9. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and his brother John, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with them. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, I will make three dwellings here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." While he was still speaking, suddenly a bright cloud overshadowed them. And from the cloud a voice said, "This is my Son, the beloved. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell to the ground where they were overcome by fear. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, "Get up and do not be afraid." And when they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus himself alone. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus ordered them, "Tell no one about the vision until after the Son of Man has been raised from the dead."
Then we have Exodus 24:12-18. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and wait there, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and the commandment, which I have written for their instruction." So Moses set out with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up into the mountain of God. To the elders he had said, "Wait for us here until we come to you again, for Aaron and Hur are here with you. Whoever has a dispute may go to them." Then Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it for 6 days. On the 7th day he called to Moses out of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like the devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel. Moses entered the cloud and went up on the mountain. Moses was on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, Nikki, for both of those readings. May God bless the reading of the Word this day. 40 days and 40 nights. What is it about 40 days and 40 nights? Why does that keep showing up over and over in the Bible? And how many other places do we see 40 days and 40 nights? How long does it take to pick up a couple of tablets of stone and get back down the mountain? 40 days and 40 nights, evidently, is exactly how long it takes. Well, I did a little research to see how many places I could come up with 40s, okay? Obviously, 40 days and 40 nights. What's the first story you think of? Noah's Ark, the flood. 40 days and 40 nights it rained. That's a long time. It's good to be on the mountain those 40 days, I guess. Moses is on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus, temptation in the wilderness. He's fasting for 40 days and 40 nights. Elijah ate one holy meal and then took a journey to the mountain where he waited to hear from God. Do you remember that story? And there was a storm and lightning and earthquakes and all kinds of powerful things. And then he hears God in the whisper on the wind, the still small voice. And that took 40 days and 40 nights. 40 days, here's one I didn't know. For 40 days and 40 nights, it's in the Bible, Goliath, the giant, remember him? The guy that David whacked with the slingshot? For 40 days, he taunted the Israelites. For 40 days, twice a day, he came out and jeered and danced and teased them until David finally took revenge on him. I didn't know that. 40 days. Here's one. The Egyptian people took 40 days to embalm a body. And the reason was because that was the period of time that they understood that it would take for a person to finish one life and establish themselves in the next life. To enter the afterlife was a 40-day process for the ancient Egyptians. How about that? 40 days, here's one. It's a rabbinical practice that the ritually impure are immersed in 40 measures of water according to the law of Moses in the Torah. And the reason is that 40 measures of water will cleanse it, purify it. Okay? So now, if 40 measures of water cleanses something ritually and makes it pure, do you get the significance of 40 days of rain in the Noah story. The earth is made ritually pure and clean after 40 days of rain and water in Genesis. 40 days. And you know, if 40 days isn't enough, then there's 40 years. Moses was 40 years old when he left Egypt. He spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness, and he came back and he led the Israelites out into the wilderness to wander for another 40 years. They got the right guide. He'd already done that once, and so Israel's wandering years, Moses' wandering years, represented in 40s again. You know, either there's an awful lot of coincidence in the Bible, or God is so particular that things actually happen in these 40-day and 7-day and 12-day and year increments, or these numbers mean something different. If you listen to Joseph Campbell, and I should have probably looked all this up, but I didn't. Joseph Campbell points out that there's these numbers to the powers of 432 that happen in the universe over and over again. And there's a book called Thou Art That, which is a great book to read. It's a short little synopsis of a lot of Campbell's work. It's easy to read. It's not that long, unlike so much of Joseph Campbell's work, which is long and difficult to read. But he points out how the number of years that it takes the zodiac to cycle, the precession of equinoxes, is like 24,000 and some odd number, and it comes out to a power of 432. And he can show you how in all of the ancient religions there are appearances of powers of this number over and over, including this, that when you add up all of the years in the Genesis and Exodus stories, that so-and-so lived this long and had a son who lived this long, and the generations that pass, you come up with the exact same number that's found in other ancient world religions. It's quite possible people wrote that in there. Now, here's something I want to help you with. When you read the Bible again, and you don't have access to all this information, or you haven't used that access, then I want you to just say to yourself, when I come across a passage that has a number, like 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, or when Jesus says, you forgive 70 times 7 times, whenever you come across numbers, the number of generations, the age of people when they die, I want you to just say to yourself, even if I don't know the context, these numbers are significant. They mean something deeper. And it's not a hidden code. It's something that was so simple and obvious to the ancient reader, they would have gotten it just like that. It was not a hidden code. It's hidden to us because we are so many thousands of years later that we've lost that context. It doesn't matter how long Moses was up on the mountain. I promise you this, when they retold the story, it was going to be 40 days and 40 nights. And here's something you need to know. When we read a story, we are interested in the details. And when the ancient storytellers read and told and wrote stories, they too were interested in the details. Every detail is intentional. But a difference is that we look to the details for the truth to tell us what happened in the story. And they were more interested in telling you the truth about the story in the details. You see, it doesn't matter how long Moses was on the mountain. In the retelling, it was going to be 40 days and 40 nights. It doesn't matter how long the flood lasted. It was going to be 40 days and 40 nights for the earth to be ritually pure. So, what's going on in these two texts? Well, there's one thing that's going on that I want you to just kind of take with you and understand. That in the Exodus text, what's happening here is that the writer is giving sacred credibility to the Torah, to the Old Testament, to the Hebrew Scriptures. How do we know that this is reliable, sacred, and true? We know simply because in the story it tells you that Moses went up on the mountain and there he received from God. Okay? In the New Testament story with Jesus on the mountain, who is Jesus talking to? Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets. So when the writers of the New Testament are trying to make sure that the people, the readers of their day, have permission to hold these new writings at the same credibility as the Old Testament, they have this story of Jesus on the mountain and Moses and Elijah and Jesus being seen the same. And the voice from God, which they had already heard at Jesus' baptism, say, "This is my Son in whom I am well pleased," adds another statement in this story, and it is, "Listen to him." These words are credible and true. This might as well be what they're writing. These words can be trusted. But there's more going on. There's more going on in both stories that has significance for us today. One of the things is that there is this waiting. Moses is told by God, come up on the mountain and wait. Even in the story with Jesus, the disciples see this great event and then they want to respond immediately. And Jesus says in terms of their response, wait. Don't build a shelter. As a matter of fact, when you go back down the mountain, don't even talk about what happened here today. Wait until the Son of Man has been resurrected from the dead, and then it'll be time to talk. Waiting seems to be a part of entering into the realm of God. As Moses leaves the bottom of the mountain and enters the cloud, he leaves this zone of humanness and he enters into the presence of God. And again, one way to talk about that is to say specifically 40 days and 40 nights. Moses is in a complete period of time immersed in the complete and total presence of God. Wait. Boy, that's not what you want to hear ever, is it? Wait. You tell your kids that, wait, and then what do? Well, I don't want to wait, and they nag and they nag. Waiting is hard. When I went on my male rites of passage, the thing we call MROP, men's rites of passage, it's a week-long retreat for those of you who have never heard of it, and it was designed by Richard Rohr, and it was influenced by a number of people, and it's now this worldwide movement, and it's taken on a lot of different motifs now as it continues to grow. The only way I can describe it is something like a vision quest for 5 days. It was a time of fasting. It was a time of slowing down. It was a time of relating to God. It was a time of allowing myself to be open to God's leading my life into directions that I may not have anticipated or may not even approve of. It was just a time to recognize how much of my spiritual life was about me and my ego and how often I needed to yield to God. It was a lot of things rolled up into 1 week. And at the end of the week, Richard told us this story. He said there was a man who had spent his entire career in the army, and he was discharged, and upon his discharge he was trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life, and there on the first day as he was thinking, he was approached by a dark stranger. It's always a dark stranger, isn't it? And the dark stranger asked him what he was doing, and he told him, I'm trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. I've just gotten out of the military. And so the dark stranger says to him, I have a proposition. You come with me, and I'm going to hire you to cut wood and stoke 3 fires for me. And if you keep those 3 fires burning for 7 years, I will give you a great, enormous bag of gold. A great wealth will be yours. And so the man goes with the dark stranger, and they go into this great cavernous pit where there are 3 boiling pots, and he begins to chop wood. And there he's tasked for 7 years to cut wood. Caution not to look in the pots. Of course, what's the first thing he's going to do when no one's around is he's going to look. And so in one was the head of his drill instructor floating, and he chopped wood all the more to keep that one boiling hot. And in another was the head of the person who had wounded him the most in his life. And so there he chopped even harder, and finally in the last one was the head of his greatest enemy in life, and he just chopped all the more. And he stoked those fires until they burned as hot as they could for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, the stranger returns and gives him, as he promised, a great bag of gold. Well, the man goes out immediately and becomes quite drunk and begins to spend money lavishly and becomes drunk to the point of blacking out. And he wakes up the next morning to realize that he had given away the entire bag of gold, that he was completely broke and back to square one. And so what happens? The dark stranger, 7 more years of chopping wood. Now, the point of that story, Richard told us, was this. When you go home from this retreat experience, don't talk about what happened here for a while. You see, what happens there is silly things like people wave these plastic bull roars and they make noise and they whistle in the air. And it tells you to take your shirt and your shoes off and to come into sacred space, and people teach you things. That doesn't sound like very much at all, does it? What happens there is that we're told to go out in the yard and be quiet and take a journal with us and think about what we've just heard for hours at a time. That doesn't sound like an awful lot, does it? Matter of fact, if you think about what happened to you in your greatest spiritual experience and you thought about it outside that context, it might cause you to say, well, you know, there wasn't really that much going on here. It wasn't magic. And here's the danger. I've seen it happen. When people come back from these great experiences and they begin to talk about what went on, and people around them begin to look at them and go, really? That was it? That's what you did? Then the next thing is that they themselves begin to doubt that they actually had this experience. They gave away their gold before it was theirs, before they owned it. Do you understand that? Can you imagine Jesus on the mountaintop with these disciples, and they have seen this glorious vision of Jesus with Moses and Elijah, and they're like, we want to build 3 shelters here, and it's like, no, we're not staying here. So we're going back down, so then we're going to get down here, and Jesus already knows. They can't wait to get down there and start telling everybody, man, you won't believe what happened up there, and I was there, and I got to go. And Jesus is like saying to them, have you ever been on a walk to Emmaus? And what do they tell you? When you go home, be careful because you have changed, but the world hasn't. The world is still sitting there ready to measure your experience. Tell me again what you did. Really, you passed a wooden cross around and you prayed for each other. That's really something. No, when you're out there, it's really something. You see, too many times we don't own our experience before we want to talk about it, before we want to rationalize it, before we want to explain it. We don't really own it. And that's not always our fault. When I was saved, when you were saved, did it look like when I was saved, I went running down to the front and I said the prayer at the end of the track? I can't tell you how many people I led in that prayer. And I was told in a moment I was saved. And while I understand there's a truth to this, that in a moment of time God accepted me, is it brass to say, I really think God did that when you and I were in the womb? I don't think it happened the day I said the prayer, okay? Although saying the prayer didn't hurt me. It was good for me. But they told me that it was now did you, like me, have this expectation that all of a sudden I'm going to be able to do good things? I was a teenager when I did this. It's not easy to have pure thoughts when you're a teenager, okay? When the impure ones come back, you're like, well, I'm wondering if I really got this. Should I go down to the front again and try one more time? I thought that I would understand Scripture and be able to explain Scripture. As a matter of fact, my youth director thought the same thing, because once you got baptized, they wanted you in the group handing out the tracts. And so when people had a question, I'm like, well, it's on page 4. You can't get it. Because I didn't know the answer. But they thought I should. Were you like me? Did you think that something immediate was going to happen and you were going to become like a Christian person and have answers and have patience and have resolve that you'd never had before? And were you like me? Were you just totally blown when that didn't happen? They didn't teach me how to wait. Wait. And you know why? Because where I came from, waiting is not good. Where I come from, waiting is loitering. And they have signs downtown. Don't do that. No loitering. You kids on those skateboards, get off the sidewalk. No loitering unless you're an old man who chews tobacco and whittles. No one else is allowed to congregate and just take up space. Well, Shannon and I made an acronym for you this week. Waiting for the Lord doesn't have to look like you're asleep. Use the letters in the word wait. Waiting, the first thing you should do when you're waiting on God in your life is to work. No one said it was your vacation period to wait. Work. If you're on a retreat and you were supposed to be being silent and being still, work at being silent and being still. If you have heard from God and you're trying to understand what God is saying and you think God is leading you in a direction, wait and work while you wait. Hey, be aware. Be aware of who you are. Be aware of what you're doing. Be aware that you are in a process of waiting and discerning what you have heard from God. Be involved. Invest yourself. Don't do this alone. When you hear God's voice, I'm going to tell you this. I just don't believe that God tells you to go tell people things. I think God tells you to go ask people things. Okay? So I'm with one of my friends who says, I hate to be at the meeting when that person says, the Lord told me to tell us to do this. Because who can argue with the Lord? But the better approach is, well, is God saying to us? Because if God is saying that to you and you're on a team of people, God's probably saying it to other people on the team as well. Involve yourself. Be in people's lives. Have people in your lives. Invest yourself. And be transparent. Be truthful. Don't wait and disguise yourself, but be honest about who you are, where you are, what you're waiting for. Waiting is not sleeping, but it's waiting on God. It's listening for God. It's investing yourself as we wait. I don't have many examples for this, and if this one is tired and worn out, then I apologize, but it's all I've got. My wife calls our time of separation now the storm. And when the storm happened, I did what I do best. I talked. I talked so much that it made her mad at me for a little while. But I talked because I was listening to people. And I wanted to gather other people's stories because we weren't the first couple to encounter the storm. And so I talked to other people, and some people told me that they recognized that activity, that storm, that time. And some people said to me, we made it through the storm. It took time. It took 2 and 3 years of time is what people would tell me. And I didn't want to hear that because when you're on this end of 2 years, you're like, oh, it's too long. I can't suffer like this for that long. And then they would tell me that we're still together because at the end of that period of time, both people were still waiting. And then I listened to other people's stories that said, one lady actually told me this story, and this is not because the girl play a specific role, but she said, when I left, there was a period of time that went by and I realized that I wanted to go back, but I couldn't because my husband had remarried. That happens. You see, some of us, I've been through divorces too. It's hard for me to talk about this because I can't sit up here and tell you how every story ends. And I can't tell you to imitate me or do what I did. That's not what I'm trying to do. But there was this awareness in my mind that Shannon and I had been together 18 years and 3 months was not enough time. That an investment of 18 years was worth a little more time in the waiting. And it was very, very hard to do. If you went through one of those and it didn't work out like that, I love you. I respect you. I'm encouraging you today. And God is too. God blesses second and third marriages, and God blesses the simplest effort I'm able to bring. I've been through a relationship where it didn't end right. It didn't end well. But in your rebuilding, here's what I want you to know. That the same storms are going to come. And I pray that all of us are rebuilding. When our relationships, not only to our spouses, but our children, crumble and fall apart, wait. Don't just give up. That's not waiting. Work. Be aware of who you are and where you are. Invest yourself. You know what God would say to me more than anything is if you want that relationship to be alive, do things that will empower it to be alive. When you're ready for it to die, do things that will kill it. And God was on Doug's side. God was on Shannon's side. It didn't matter. But what do you want? If you want it to be alive, invest in things that make it alive. So if you're waiting for a child, if you're waiting for a spouse, if you're waiting for your relationship to the church, if you're waiting on your relationship to God to grow deeper, wait by working, investing yourself. Be aware of who you are and be truthful and transparent at all times. And don't try to do it alone. Don't do it alone. And most especially when you hear from God. When you reach these benchmarks and milestones in your spiritual journey, when you go on an MROP or an Emmaus walk, or you go to a men's or women's retreat, or you hear a sermon, or someone in your life close to you passes away, or when someone reappears in your life, when the things that happen that are your life come and they create these growth situations in this liminal space for you, and it always gets created for you, you don't do it. When that happens, wait. Don't come charging in and say, God gave me the answer today. Think of really good questions. And wait. And now, wherever you are, reach out and grab a hold of the hand of the person closest to you. If you're lucky, it's somebody you like. If you're not, you sat in the wrong place today. And while you wait, do this too. Hang on. Just hang on, man. Okay? If you're going over the falls, we're going with you. Do y'all get that? No condemnation here. If you're going over the falls, we're going with you. And if we're going to sit in the pool and paddle and tread water a while, we'll lift you up when you're tired. But hang on. That's the good news. Maybe it's the bad news. It's all you got. It's all you got. That and the grace of God, which fills in the gaps in our lives that we leave in our imperfect relationships. Will you pray with me now?